Hello, literary lovers, and welcome to 21 Conversations, the 2021 Greensboro-bound Literary Festival. I am Paula Pierce, one of the board members of Greensboro Literary Organization. Greensboro-bound is so excited to present to you these 21 conversations, our effort to create something unique and special for our community within the confines of our continued virtual environment. 21 Conversations pays homage to North Carolina's rich literary history while broadening our tent to welcome in voices from outside our own microcosm of experience. This featured presentation is but a taste of the 52 authors that we have gathered together in a series of delightful, sometimes unexpected, but always edifying conversations. Since our inception, Greensboro Bound has been committed to providing programs like the one you are about to watch, 100% free to our community. In order to do that, we need the financial support, both big and small, of readers just like you. Please support Greensboro Bound by giving now. The text to give phone number, as well as our website, are on your screen. A sustaining gift of just $15 a month or the cost of a single children's book will help us remain financially solvent throughout the year. I also want to take a moment to thank our sustaining supporters, without whom Greensboro Bound would not be possible. Our utmost gratitude to the Edward M. Armfield Senior Foundation, the Rooflands Memorial Fund, and Arts Greensboro for their continued belief in our vision to bring together readers and writers of all genres, ages, ethnicities, identities, and voices to foster an understanding of writing, a process that allows free expression, deepens critical thought, and helps sustain a culture of inquiry and delight that is open to all. Thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you everybody for being here today, and thank you again to Downtown Greensboro for sponsoring Greensboro Bound in this session. Y'all are going to hear a lot today about the historic Magnolia House, but I wanted to share our plans that are underway as we wrap up a big week of fundraising. We're working to restore the Magnolia House's physical building and recreate the operations of Greensboro's Green Book Hotel. We're doing this by reopening the hotel this year with the goal of creating a living history experience for Triad residents and tourists. To keep up with us as we continue this project, because a lot's going to be happening over the next few months, feel free to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or head over to our website, thehistoricmagnoliahouse.org. Thank y'all so much.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much. It's a great way to spend this Sunday afternoon, but I do want to thank Downtown Greensboro for, I know how hard it is to get sponsorship sometime, and when people step forward and do that, it's always a beneficial thing, but a thing that we should show gratitude towards. Also, Greensboro Bound, and I also want to, in advance, thank Natalie Pass Miller and CANDACY TAYLOR for joining us this afternoon. But I'm RODNEY DAWSON. I'll be trying to stay out of the way and host a good conversation with Mrs. Taylor and Mrs. Pass Miller, and talking about a wonderful book that I've gotten a chance to read just this past week. And I was telling my wife I'm glad I did, because it fits a lot of my wheelhouses. And so Miss CANDACY TAYLOR coming to us from Harlem, New York. I'm gonna read a bio on you, and then I'm also read a short bio on Natalie Pass Miller. These are some accomplished women. So reading these bios, you know, they can take some time, but I try to do it as brief as possible. But you're an award-winning author. And not only that, you're a photographer, cultural documentarian, and which is something I'm dabbling in now. and you're working on a multidisciplinary project based on the Green Book, which we'll be talking about. And she is the author of the best-selling book that we're talking about, Overground Railroad, the Green Book, and the Roots of Black Travel in America. Taylor is also the curator and content specialist for exhibition at the Negro Motorist Green Book, which is being toured by CITES, the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Services. We're familiar with CITES. We hosted an exhibit, the Greensboro History Museum I'm talking about, hosted the American Democracy exhibit last year. So some good folks with that organization. And Taylor was also a fellow of the Hutchins Center at Harvard University under the direction of Henry Louis Gates Jr. When I read that, I was impressed. And her projects have been funded by numerous organizations, including the Library of Congress, National Geographic, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Park Service, I'm not done, the National Trust, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Taylor's work has been featured in over 65 media outlets, including The Atlantic, CBS Sunday Morning, The Guardian UK, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Newsweek, PBS, NewsHour, the Wall Street Journal, and Taylor lives now and is joining us from Harlem, New York. So that's a mouthful. When you gonna stop working? But
never, apparently.
Okay. And Miss Pass Miller, and glad to have you here, one of Greensboro's own. Aggie Pride, Miss Miller. And I think, from reading your bio, I think we may share a good friend, good person, one of my favorite people, Evelina Diggs. I think you may know her.
Yeah. Yes. Hey, Rodney. Thanks for having me. Aggie Pride, by the way.
Aggie Pride. And so you're the owner and operator of the historic Magnolia House and Inn. You're a Greensboro native, as Aggie Pride, so we know she attended North Carolina A&T, where she received a degree in nursing. My mother went to Winston-Salem State, got a degree in nursing, and my wife is now a midwife, so you're in good company there. She later became an IT professional. My master's is in instructional technology.
Oh, Rodney.
Yeah. And you traveled around the Southeast with your family before moving back to Greensboro in 2018. We're glad you did that. You wanted to help your father sound pass. And you also wanted to complete the restoration work on the home. And Natalie has a rich family lineage. This is impressive. That includes her great-grandmother, Jefferson Davis Diggs, who was one of the founders of the school that will become Winston-Salem State University. I actually have an old picture from when it was, I can't remember from 1890, 18 something. I can't remember the original name, but I have an old picture that someone brought to me of Winston-Salem State. And her uncle, Samuel Penn, was Greensboro's first Black police officer. And her aunt, Eloise Logan Penn, was the first Black woman to run a music program in local schools. And she created the Delta Sigma Theta Sweetheart Song. And so in April, the Magnolia House announced that it would once again open as an inn this fall. And I'll talk about it later, but I believe we're kind of having a small partnership in June, on June 19th with Magnolia House and the Greensboro History Museum. But nonetheless, thank you for joining us too. And I believe you're joining us from the Magnolia House, right?
We are.
Good, great. We have to get over there soon. But let's jump right into it. Miss Taylor, CANDACY Taylor. I know this was a large undertaking and a long undertaking. What has to go through your mental psyche to say, I want to write a book and I want to travel the country for over 20 years to do it?
Well, I think, I was really not in my right mind because looking back on it, it is a crazy thing that I decided to do. And even when I was involved with the scholarly research and I had done so much of the background work. I started this project in 2013, actually. I've been a travel writer, cultural documentarian for 20 years. But I learned about the Green Book in 2013 and found out basically by accident, kind of stumbled onto it by accident. I was doing research for another book and I realized this had to be my project. But once I really got into it and I got the fellowship at Schomburg and I got the fellowship at Harvard, I could have written a book at that point in about 2016, but it wasn't until I'd spent so many years on the road and so many miles going to these places where the Green Book sites were clustered. So these neighborhoods, these traditional African-American neighborhoods, that I really understood the context of how different racial policies, different social systems in this country have shifted the function and the vitality and the reality of these, of America and our history with this. So then I decided to write a different kind of a book. And that's what we have now, is this book that really doesn't just talk about the Green Book as a historic time capsule. It really looks chronologically, decade by decade, from the 30s to now. The story of like how we are rediscovering ourselves and the mistakes that we keep making and the progress we've made despite all of the obstacles. And so it was a much harder book to write, but but it's done, thank God. And now it lives in the world. And yeah, and I just want to say I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for the introduction. I don't think I've ever had anybody read my bio so lively. It was very sweet and amusing, but I'm just really happy to be here.
Well, we're glad you're here, and I'm going to ask Ms. Miller a question, but to put a bug in your ear, we're going to come back and I'm going to ask you about Are We There Yet? And ask you specifically about Ron.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about how we make progress and we have to take 2 steps back, and you have some glowing illustrations of that throughout the book, which I was pleased to see, from the 1930s up until now. Of course, we know it predates that, but I asked Ms. Taylor about what has to go into the mind state you have to be in to embark upon a project like this. And so Natalie Miller, your family purchased the historic Magnolia House. What does your mind have to be like to take on something that has such historical importance and the challenges of keeping it going?
So, I think for me, and very similar in terms of stumbling upon the historic Magnolia House and what it represented. Coming in to this project with Dad was really about stabilizing an operation he was trying to get stood up. Not aware of the history, not aware of my family heritage, none of that. And so when we moved here to really kind of just dig in 100% full time, that was around September of 2018. And then October, November is when the Green Book movie came out. Mm-hmm. And so what kind of mindset do you have to be in? I think, as a historic preservationist, it really is what I consider a service role. And it's really all about, you're given all of this historical information, you're given all of these stories that aren't told, aren't shared, aren't well known, and you're in a position to make a decision on what you're going to do with that. And so having this rich history, understanding the depth of this narrative of something so simple as traveling Negroes just trying to get to one spot from point A to point B, it's not something you can take lightly and just brush over and just continue life moving on. You really need to think about, and we have to share that. And so that's just where my mind was. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. After reading this, I got a newfound appreciation for yourself and those that work with you, because I started thinking about Victor Hugo Green and having to embark on putting a book like this together. We know this wasn't the only one, but his was the more popular one. And before we got here, I'm gonna make sure both of y'all kind of tell folks that may not know exactly what the Green Book meant, what it is. Mm-hmm. But for him in the 1930s, I think it was 1936 when he started, 1936, to start a book like this, to get it publicized, to promote it, to advertise it, to get sales agents, to find different printers, and just deal with all these different dynamics in a time where people will have prejudices against you, have biases against you, and just to keep pushing this thing and keep it going and keep it going. I said, what a remarkable challenge. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I could undertake something like that. And so when I read this book and saw that, and then I had a newfound appreciation for the Magnolia House, I'm like, man, it should have had more prominence, more positioning. I should have known a lot more about it and been more appreciative about it. Because I think about when I was I'm gonna tell my age, but I'm old.
All right.
One thing I forgot to do was turn the phone down. Yeah, you know, a little Sade now, but
That's all right.
I started thinking about how much, and I want Miss Candacy Taylor to tell us about Ron, but how much in my growing up in the 1970s, how my mom she sung in a local gospel group, and they would travel, and we would pull over to the side of the room side of the road so they could use the restroom, so they could use the bathroom because they didn't feel comfortable or couldn't go to a gas station or something of that nature. And that all has lineage with the Green Book. So Candacy Taylor, are we there yet? Ron, your stepfather, when those folks pick the book up, it's a beautiful book too.
Thank
And
you.
as I'm reading it, my favorite part was the introduction.
Oh, yeah.
All right, now it's the epilogue is kind of balancing out, but it's the introduction because it sets the tone for the book. And it gives it that, it brought it home to me when I heard the story of Ron. But talk to us about Ron and this first introduction to the book.
Yeah, thank you. I rewrote that introduction, I don't know, maybe 12 times. And so, yeah, thanks for remarking on that, because it was I really did have to be careful about balancing the tone of the reality of what we're dealing with, where we've been and where we're going. Part of what was so significant, my entryway into this history, was through Ron, my stepfather. Ron Burford, he was from the South. He was from Memphis, Tennessee. Grew up, during Jim Crow, dark-skinned Black man. And, I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and my mother, very fair-skinned, could pass, was with my stepfather, who's very dark-skinned. And I'd known this man most of my life. From a young age, he came into our lives and he was basically my father. So when I found out about the Green Book in 2013, I saw one underneath glass in the Autry Museum. I was living in Los Angeles, and I go outside and I call my parents. I say, have you heard of this? Have you seen this? I didn't know such a thing existed. And my mother hadn't heard of it, but Ron, my stepfather, had. And even though he's a man from the South who loves to talk, and he can tell story after story after story, it wasn't until I was doing this research and working on this book, when I finally committed to this work, he would tell me stories I'd never heard before. And there was a certain vulnerability and I think trust that we established, and our relationship really shifted into something more deep and meaningful. He would tell me stories because I would read about chauffeurs' hats being used as a prop that Black men, especially who had nicer cars, would have in their car in case they were pulled over and harassed by law enforcement. They would pretend it wasn't their car, and they would say, I'm a chauffeur. And I asked Ron one day, I was sitting I was in the kitchen, and I said, is this true? And he tells me the story about how it happened to him when he was age 7. His father had a good job with the railroad, and they were traveling north, taking a vacation. His mother's in the front seat. They get pulled over by a sheriff, and his father basically turned to him and said, don't say a word. And that's how the book starts out, with Ron in the front seat of the car, or in the back seat of the car, having to navigate this very tense, scary situation where his father pretends he didn't know them. Said, this is the maid. Turns to his wife, pretends he doesn't know her. Said, this is her son. I'm driving them home. And he said after that event, when he was 7, he would see chauffeurs' hats in the back seats of almost every Black man's car he rode in. And it was really powerful. It almost made me cry in that moment, because even though I had read all of these stories outside or in the history books or in the archives, and I'm standing here right in front of this man who I'd known most of my life, who basically is saying, telling me stories that I had never known. And I didn't understand until years later what it took for him to trust me with this information. And, the story, I won't go too much longer, but he died. Ron passes literally the week I start writing the book. And we had spent so much time on the phone on my road trips doing this research. And I was devastated when he died. And I was sitting there, and I only had 8 months to write this book. So I was just crazy. I mean, I don't, like I said, I don't know why or how I did it, and I was crying for about 2 weeks writing Ron's stories. I just like, I told my agent, I said, I know I'm supposed to be writing the book. I said, but all I can do is write down Ron's stories because I don't want to forget them. And then after about a week, I said, well, I think I'm going to open the introduction with the story about the chauffeur's hat. And then I realized all of those stories were a touchstone for almost every chapter in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ron becomes a narrative thread in the book. Had he not passed, that wouldn't have happened. So it was one of those bittersweet, things where he does get to be kind of the star he deserves to be. But I probably wouldn't have done it had he lived. So, I'm glad that it resonates with so many people, and people do. It really, it helped me understand so many things about him that were so, frankly, sometimes irritating, driving at night. Without, like, he'd make all these decisions.
Explain that, because that it resonated with me when he said that. I identified with that, but explain that really quick if you can.
Yeah, anytime he would go down south to go see his family, he would only leave at 10 o'clock at night, and it drove me crazy, and I would get really upset because it's dangerous. And he'd drive all night with my mother in the car, and I'm like, why are you risking my mother's, first of all, her life, everybody else's life on the road, and your own, because you're too stubborn to drive during the day? And he's like, oh, traffic. He would just say traffic. I don't want to drive because of traffic. And it would make me mad. I'm thinking, he's so stubborn and he's just being difficult. And then it wasn't until I was writing this book that I realized, he wanted to be invisible. He was in law enforcement. So it's not that he was he just knew the reality of being a dark-skinned Black man, driving a nicer car, even today. He's like, I don't want to deal with it. So he would drive in the middle of the night and be invisible. And it made perfect sense once I started writing the book. But those were the realizations of Ron that came to me through this material.
Now, thank you for that. Natalie, do you have any stories that maybe your father shared or other folks in your family have shared with you that kind of help strengthen your tie between you, your family, and the Magnolia House?
So yes, I'll tell you, my dad, so my father, Sam Pass, he bought the home from the Gist family back in 1995. And the Gist family, they were the ones that purchased the home and turned it into the Green Book Hotel in 1949. And my dad and I both grew up in the same neighborhood, a street over from the historic Magnolia House. And my dad, he would talk a lot about the childhood memories of, when we think about what the 50s and 60s looked like on Gorell Street, which is where we sit, you're seeing these little kids running up and down the street to see, oh, the fancy car that pulled up at the Magnolia House, or who was going to be, getting out of those cars. Because they were, notable people, and some of the guests, being out on the front porch and signing autographs. And so that was the connection that Dad had with the home. Mm-hmm. And when it fell into disrepair and the Gist family were in the process of selling it, Dad very quickly activated from just knowing and understanding and experiencing what it was like from the home. I've talked with, during when we used to have our Sunday brunch and tours, mm-hmm. I'd say it has to be a good 20% of the storytelling comes from our brunchers. And, we'd have gentlemen, one guy, he remembers, playing in the street with James Brown when he would stay here and be playing, baseball with the neighborhood kids, right? And then just seeing the construction, as Dad was going through and restoring the home. And so I think the community being able to be involved, engaged in that way, growing up with the home, even going through the period of construction and restoration work that Dad was doing, that provided a connection there. And knowing all of this and knowing, not only what the Magnolia House stood for, but also, honoring the Gist family. When you think about them as a family unit, they were some pretty badasses in the civil rights era. They had a lot to contribute there. So, those are the things that kind of fuel and motivate, along with my family heritage, when we think about, how do we share this house? How does a community continue to experience that?
Yeah, so you dropped one name. I'm gonna have to get out of this introduction. I'm looking at it's already 2:28, and I'm still stuck on the introduction. They may not ask me back, but you dropped. You talked about James Brown, but you got Louis Armstrong, and James Baldwin and Sam Cooke that have been there, and then as you read, as Candacy points out, or what did I read this? No, I read this in some information on the Magnolia House. It wasn't just celebrities that came to stay there. It was other folks, Greensboro natives and folks from different parts of the country that would come for college graduations. They would need a place to stay because here in Greensboro, we have Bennett College, historically Black college and university. Then we have North Carolina A&T. So you'd have folks like that. But I have some good friends of ours that have become kind of like a mentor to my wife and I, Shirley Fry and Justice Henry Fry. And they took us out for something. And anyway, they were telling us about, it was either a wedding reception. I think it was a wedding reception. I think it was held at the Magnolia House. And they shared with us some stories that took place then after they got married and had the reception there. So it's just a lot of rich social justice, rich Greensboro history there, as well as a national and international. So I'm gonna get out of this introduction, but I'm stuck on Victor Hugo Green. So Ms. Taylor, talk to us about Victor Hugo Green, a man with a 7th grade education.
Yeah.
Started this book. I understand he was a very tall, kind of regal figure that took over a room.
Yes, Victor Green was incredible. He was a postal worker from Harlem. He started the Green Book in 1936. We think there were a few reasons that, he came up with it. As you said, in the introduction, the Green Book wasn't the only Black travel guide, and it wasn't the first. The first was Hackley and Harrison's in 1930. But Victor Green's was the second in 1936, and Hackley and Harrison's was only around for 2 years, 1930 and 1931. But Victor Green was living in Harlem at a time, right, the Harlem race riot took place in 1935 when he was living there. Much of Harlem, 125th Street, was very segregated. There were still a lot of places Black folks couldn't go. So even within the confines of this so-called Mecca of, Black culture and arts, was still very heavily segregated. So he created the Green Book to fix his own issues being in Harlem, because it was the first edition was about 10 pages. Nobody's actually seen that edition. We have the 1937 edition at the Schomburg. You can Google NYPL Green Book and you can look at all the editions they have. They have, I think, 24 now, maybe 25. So it's pretty amazing to see that this was just really a local kind of zine. No pictures, it was very simple. Well, there were ads, but there was, it was a very simple layout. And this man, Victor Green, 6 feet tall, Alma Duke Green was his wife. I think she was a big player in the success of the Green Book because Victor was working full-time as a postal worker, going to New Jersey. He was commuting. And she was she ends up becoming the publisher and the editor the last year of his life, takes over the Green Book until Victor Green dies in 1960, so he never even sees the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Alma takes over till mid-60s, 62, and then Langley Waller took over the last from 64 to 67. But it's it's an incredible story because I think Victor Green is almost like the Steve Jobs of his time. He really was, I don't think he intended or had any idea of the power that such a guide could bring in changing people's lives and having access to golf courses, beaches, the freedom of travel within the country and outside of the country was monumental in terms of how we found ourselves in spaces that we had been shut out of. So it was revolutionary what he did. And he was an incredible, fearless man who used everything from crowdsourcing. He was almost like a Madam C.J. Walker, he had this groundswell of postal workers who were part of the union, who had worked all over the country, and that's how he found all these different pockets in different cities throughout the country. They would solicit for advertising and tell Black-owned business. It was the Black Yellow Pages of its time, celebrated Black entrepreneurship, and it was just incredible. There's a whole chapter on Victor Green in the book, and you can learn more about it. But he was a game changer, and rarely gets the recognition that he should. So that
Was he able to accumulate any wealth?
I saw some of his records, especially as far as we know, he didn't really make much of a profit off of the Green Book. Because the advertisers didn't really have to pay unless they were purchasing a large, an ad or a full page ad. And the Green Book sold for between 75 cents and $1.50. I think it got as high as $1.50. And there were about 2 million people using it, in the 60s. So it did reach an incredible amount, but he had an office in Harlem on top of Small's Paradise. It was a viable working business. He had editors, he had, a staff. It was very well run. But as far as we know, he didn't, if he made a profit, he wasn't wealthy from doing the Green Book. I think it was a labor of love.
Okay. Speaking, I'm gonna come back. I'm gonna ask you about Sundown or Sunset Towns, and if we have time, I'm gonna get into Esso, the Esso, and even Miss Spellman, if we can. I found that fascinating. But Natalie, what would the Magnolia House? How many folks could it accommodate? Like if James Brown came to town and brought his entire entourage, would that fill up the residence?
So that would fill up the residence. So when the Magnolia House was open, they opened up 5 rooms upstairs to guests that stayed. And what was really awesome was what I would say the collaboration, because we're not the only Green Book site here in Greensboro. And what was really, I think, for me, really powerful is how Magnolia House, Plaza Manor, and I can't think of the other one, but they would actually work together when they had large parties coming in. For example, when we co-host the NAACP's national convention that was here in Greensboro. And so that's how they were able to accommodate, the large groups. But they had 5 rooms that they would open up. And some guests, like Louise Armstrong, treated it as an extended stay. Louis would hang out with us for 3 weeks at a time. So him and Mama Guest, they would have a special relationship going on. But yeah, through collaboration of our other partners.
So what does it look like, or let me ask you this, what does it look like currently in the grounds, but particularly behind the residence? What would that be used for? And I'm gonna go ahead and throw this in. Are you wanting to restore that as well? And if so, what do you want it to look like? What's the expectation?
Yeah, so back during the Green Book heyday, that was a next door neighbor that we had. Our backyard had a house in it, or sitting on it. Today, when you walk into the building, my dad, who is just a phenomenal visionary, he intentionally restored the home from its 1949 structure. So the home is a Victorian Italianate home that was built in 1889. And then when the Guest family came in, Papa Guest was a brick mason, so they made it their own. And so when you walk through today, you're actually walking through the 1949 Green Book Hotel layout. And so that's what's there. Now, we do have the backyard today. And so what's to come with that is we are going to be actually breaking ground and building an additional art center, as well as our African American Historical History Museum, as well as some other projects that we have going on. But right now, with the current structure, our focus is really on making sure that we replicate the operation and the structure of what the guests did.
Now, you're one of only 4 left in the state. I didn't look it up. Do you know the other 3?
So when we worked with the African American Heritage Commission, Lisa Withers and Angela Thorpe, really, really good partners. We partnered and worked with them on their Oasis Spaces Green Book exhibit. And part of the phenomenal research that Lisa Withers did, along with Angela's team, we found that I think there was around 320 some odd Green Book sites in the state of North Carolina. And upon the research of that project, we found that there were 66, I think it's a little over 60 structures that still exist. In terms of one of maybe 4, between 4 and 6, we are one of between 4 and 6 that are, yes, still structurally has the structural layout as the original building, but then also functions as the original building.
Okay.
And when we think about the others, so Plaza Manor is very, very close to. And then there are 2 others, and I'm sorry, the name is not, it's failing on me right now. So we can definitely circle back around and share that information.
I think, Chicken and Ribs is one, right?
Say that again.
Chicken and Ribs. That is on Betty's Ford Road. And Bennett College was also in the Green Book.
Okay.
There were a lot of universities, a lot of HBCUs, and Plaza Hotel. Yeah, I'd have to look at my list too, but.
Yeah, so I know Charlotte, they have an initiative going on right now with the Excelsior Club, I believe is one. I don't know if they're true to the structure. I haven't done a lot of research there. I will tell you what hurt my heart, y'all. Is right when I started on this project with Dad, had a young lady call, give me a call, and she was really nervous and really scared because her family owned the Kilby Hotel in High Point. And it was very close to actually being demolished. And she just wanted to know what she could do to save it and hold on to it because of what it was. And that was a property that we weren't able to save. This year I went out to High Point and drove by just to circle back around on that story and see, where she was and how things were going. And I was in tears when I did not see the building there. And, that's just one example, I think, CANDACY, to, your story and the stories that you share about your travel in the book, and the emotional impact it has when you realize the historic nature of these structures and how easily we just plop a condo or a gas station or something on it just so that we can be more modern day.
Yeah, it's really striking how much, I've cataloged over 10,000 of these sites, and I've traveled to over 5,000, and I found that about less than 5% are still operating. So it's so rare and special that, that's why places like the Magnolia House need to be celebrated and supported, because we've lost so many of them. And I'm working with the National Park Service to actually rewrite the context to add for the MPDFs, the multi-property document forms that support, because what I have found, writing nominations to get Green Book sites on the National Register is not easy. It's almost increasingly, and I've tried it with several different states, and they're requiring things like you need the floor plans from 1940s, or you have to, if it became a condo, even if it's still intact, if there were any changes in the lobby area, then it's not eligible. and
Yeah.
all these architectural, issues that I kept running into. So I'm working really hard on rewriting the context so it's easier for business owners to get their properties listed on the National Register to protect them. And we find that a lot of this is happening with Black heritage, with, the cultural and significance of these places should be enough. The fact that
Yeah.
it's in the Green Book should be enough.
Yeah.
So,
So what's interesting to that, and Rodney, you're gonna have to intervene because I can get going and I'll just keep it moving and keep talking. So I'm sorry, but what's interesting is when we think about the historic register listing by the Department of Interiors. I know there's over 900,000 of those listings, period, and we're on that. The historic Magnolia House is on that.
so great.
And less than 5% of those listings are African American focused sites.
Wow.
I mean, that is heart-wrenching,
So
right?
much, right? Yeah.
And then I'll tell you a big blow to the gut. We learned, and working with with the UNCG Museum Studies students over the last year and a half.
Wonderful program, by the way.
Yes, sir. But we learned that, so when you look at the listing of Magnolia House, it's listed as the DeButts House.
Hmm.
So it's not even listed and recognized as an African American site. But then not only that, it's listed as William B. DeButts rented the home. He was not the original builder and the first family to own the home. So there's definitely some documentation challenges and things that we face for sure.
Now, you said in the book, Candace, you note that Victor Green relied on the owners to send the addresses, and sometimes it would be a digit off. So it might be, instead of the correct address was 1101, they might have 1201,
Right.
whatever street.
Yeah.
And so that made it challenging. I can imagine how challenging it was for folks that were traveling in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And so what was I want to get this in our remaining time, but what is the purpose? What sundown, I've heard sundown, sunset. What is a sundown town?
Sundown towns they were all white towns, and they were all white on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And they were throughout the country. They were largely a northern, Midwestern, and Western phenomena. I mean, the thing people assume, because especially in the North, that the South, because it had Jim Crow laws, was so much more racist. And it's not true. And essentially what happened was, like, if, for instance, the whole state of South Carolina had one sundown town, but Illinois had hundreds of them, right? So what they were, I mean, they would either have a sign right at the county line saying "Inward, don't let the sun set on you here." Some had a bell that they would ring at 6 p.m. to tell the locals, the people who were domestics and people who were in the community who were Black, who would have to, it was their cue to leave after 6. They could not be found in the town after hours. I learned about sundown towns when I was doing research on a book for Route 66, because it traveled through 8 states from Chicago to Los Angeles. And 44 out of the 89 counties on Route 66 were sundown towns. So that gives you a snapshot of just how treacherous it could have been, because there was no list of sundown towns at the time. There was no Black Twitter or any kind of internet. There's no way for them to know, except they'd be on the road and see that sign and have to find someplace else to be. And hopefully they saw the sign, because sometimes, there wouldn't be a sign. There would be some kind of emblem that was, like a mule on a mountain was one of the keys. It was a black mule, which meant get your Black ass out of town. I mean, it was crazy. So yeah, they're still, sundown towns are not a thing today, but there's definitely a lot of those. I'm doing research with National Geographic for a digital map I'm working on, where sundown towns that were all white, 99% white for decades, are still over 90% white. And yet they're saying that they through census records are saying they have a Black and brown population now of maybe 5%. But when you look closer, that Black population is in their private prisons.
Right.
So that's what I'm working on now, is seeing like what's really going on there. But yeah, it's definitely tied to our history, and we shouldn't forget. There's a book by James Baldwin called Sundown Towns that, he's the premier scholar on this subject.
Well, you don't get out of chapter 1 without you mentioning that. An hour is not enough time to go through this book. You could take a history test off of this. You talk about George Grant, the African-American dentist who designed the golf tee. But you alluded to this moments ago where you said, we recognize the South. We often talk about the South as having a racist history, and they catch much of the brunt, and it almost serves as a scapegoat for other parts of the country. And you point out in chapter 1 about Robert Moses, the president of the New York State Parks Council, and who designed these 12 bridges, 627 miles of highways, and over 2.5 million acres of park area. But he designed the bridges so they would have a low overpass, so buses wouldn't be able to go through. And that was because African Americans took buses. That, as you talked about earlier, the cars gave us freedom, but we took buses en masse, and that was a way of segregating. So elaborate on that, and let me read this statement from a gentleman talked about this from the Chicago Tribune, which is in the book on page 53. He says, "We should be doing no service to the Negroes if we did not point out that a very large section of the white population, the presence of a Negro, however well behaved, among white bathers is an irritation." This is about African Americans going to the beach. "This may be a regrettable fact to Negroes, but it is nevertheless a fact and must be reckoned with. The Negroes could make a definite contribution to good race relationship by remaining away from the beaches where their presence is resented."
Yeah, that was published in the Chicago Tribune newspaper. And you're right, it was really incredible that the car was it provided the freedom that Black people needed to get to Jones Beach or go to the there were golf courses in the Green Book. Access, it was about access. And the thing though about Robert Moses is the covert operations that were happening within the, not just, we can talk about redlining and urban renewal. I mean, there were all these social forces, these government forces. These were state parks. These were part of our city government. People pay taxes for this. Black people pay taxes for parks they couldn't use, and libraries, and et cetera. And but the Green Book was like, don't worry about it. You just drive your car. Here it is. It's over here. And as long as you have a car, you can get there. That was incredibly powerful. And I think it's crazy to me that, as Northerners look down, or even people, I lived in California for many years, and people look at the South like, it was this bad, and it's like, well, at least the South told you the truth. At least they were clear about what the rules were, because that was important. You find yourself in a place you're not familiar with, and if you don't know the rules, you're in much more danger than if it's just, in some ways. And there's chapter 5, the migration chapter, talks about Black folks who were fleeing racial terror in the South, and they got to Chicago and they got to the North, and they thought, well, it's not that different here. There's still social forces against us, and it's still dangerous. So yeah, it's I don't want to go on too long, but yeah, it was a very real issue. And I think it should, I haven't read Charles Blow's book about the reverse migration yet, but I mean, I think there's more stories about, really interrogating and dismantling that stereotype of the South, and it should be.
I really wanted to get to, I don't know if I'm gonna have a chance to get to Esso, which is now Exxon, am I correct? But what business do you have? This is supposed to be a book about, very nice cover, very, very well bound, but it's supposed to be about Green Book sites. But here you are talking about Charlottesville and policies in New York, and the Rockefeller. You just mentioned it's so many things you're touching on. So, and I understand why. And then same thing with Natalie. You're supposed to just run the Magnolia House. What are you doing trying to turn it into an African-American museum? Is this in you, or did it become in you later? I'm talking to Natalie.
So definitely it became in me later. I was very motivated and fueled and continue to be by the house's story, by the community story, by my family story. All of that drives the work that we're doing. And, it's a much larger narrative. This isn't just the work that we're doing is not just tied to just Greensboro. It's not tied to just North Carolina. It's much, much bigger in terms of preservation of our sites.
Okay, I got about 8 minutes. Esso gas station. Why it now Exxon, and I'm gonna turn it over to Jessica momentarily. But Esso gas station. Typically you had a lot of travelers didn't go out of their way to support African Americans, didn't go out of their way to support white-owned corporations because they didn't get the support back. But this was a different case with Esso, and you talked about the wife of John D. Rockefeller. Miss Spelman, and how she played a large role coming from an abolitionist background. But why was Esso why did they have such a prominence back then? Or why did you, I don't even know what I'm trying to ask. Talk to us about Esso.
Esso was, they were critical in the success and the longevity of the Green Book. Esso gas stations distributed the Green Book, so you could pick up one at one of their stations. I, like you, was questioning like what was in it for them. Why did they do this? Because Shell stations, a lot of them didn't even serve Black people. So it was a real, it wasn't uncommon for Black folks to not be served by certain stations, or you could go to the gas station and get gas and they wouldn't let you use the bathroom. That happened a lot. So Esso was one of those kind of safe zones, and it became very clear quickly within the Black, a lot of people I interviewed for this book, reiterated the fact that if you could just get to an Esso, you knew you'd be all right. But the backstory of Esso is that it literally had, it was run by Rockefeller, and his wife, Flora Spelman, grew up in a house that was on the Underground Railroad. Her parents were fierce abolitionists. Obviously, this is, Spelman College was named after their family. And I think she was a conscience to Mr. Rockefeller. But Esso hired Black chemists. They had Black men franchising their own gas stations within the company. And every level of the company, they had some kind of Black representatives. They hired Black marketing executives who worked with Victor Green. There were two, so it was not just in name only, or, they really put the money and the support to be on the right side of history. And I have always applauded, and I think it's a symbol for what corporations can do if they want to. Esso is ExxonMobil today, and ExxonMobil is sponsoring my exhibition with the Smithsonian.
Okay.
For that reason, because it's like, you were on the right side of history, let's do this. And they really stepped up and did it. So I think it's fabulous that they were so important.
Well, I encourage everyone to read the book. Like I said, we didn't have enough time to go through it. It's just so many different dynamics to it. It's multi-layered. It's a wonderful project. And because we're short on time, I'm going to ask you all to give me about 60 seconds just to talk to, you can talk about your project, the book that I encourage folks to pick up, Overground Railroad, The Green Book, and the Roots of Black Travel in America by CANDACY TAYLOR. I don't want to. And then also the historic Magnolia House. So I'm going to start with Miss Pass Miller here. Miss Pass, tell us about what we can expect to see you touched on it a little bit, in the very near future at the Magnolia House, and why we should come there.
You can expect to be able to experience our living museum and experience all of the operations that the Gist family put in place when they opened it in 1949. So, whether it's the lunches and brunches that we do, as if when Mama Gist was feeding folks, the private events and the corporate meetings, like when Piedmont Natural Gas would have their events and Charlotte Hawkins Brown would here. And then, of course, the hotel that's coming in the fall, which is, that's the actual Green Book Hotel. So that's what you all can expect from us, and just to continue to feed and educate all of those hidden gems and hidden stories that we don't talk about and celebrate.
Amen to that. How can we stay connected? What's your social media handles?
So we are on Facebook. I don't know my media handle off the top of my head, but you can go to our website. It is thehistoricmagnoliahouse.org.
Okay.
And then feel free to reach out to us via email and phone, and I can put all of that in the chat for you.
Thank you. All right. And
Thank you.
Miss Taylor, wonderful book. What
Thank
do you, when you, I'm imagining it probably changed your goal before you wrote it and then the goal after you completed this work. So what's the purpose and what would you like to see the reader walk away with when they pick up this book?
Well, like you said, it does cover so many touchstones in different parts of history. It really is tracing social mobility of Black folks over the last century.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it does, it ends with the story, the biggest civil rights crisis of our time, which is mass incarceration. And so I want people, there's a short page of just saying, what you can do. Because I think in 100 years, we're going to be scratching our heads with the same questions, like how did we get here? Why are we still dealing with this? So I want the book to inspire people to take our own initiative. We all are playing a part in this culture, regardless of our race. We're all participating in these forces that have continually become obstacles, for Black progress. So I want that to be a factor. I do have a children's book coming out. It's for young adults that's based on this book. It's called Overground Railroad. So that'll be out in 2022 in January. And, the exhibition is traveling and I've got other projects. I'm working on a mobile app. So, it takes it out into the real world and places like the Magnolia House will be featured. And so people can actually go to these places and really appreciate the history.
Okay, and thank you for that. And I encourage everyone to go to your local bookstore, but especially Scuppernong's. Go to them; they're the official, one of the official sponsors here on Elm Street, and check out Overground Railroad, the Green Book, and the Roots of Black Travel in America by Miss CANDACY TAYLOR. And then also just look out for all the fantastic things that are coming from the historic Magnolia House. And Natalie Miller, thank you so much. Please tell Everly Diggs I said hello. you're gonna give me a reason to call her. And if I get to Harlem, can I break bread with you, Miss Taylor?
Absolutely. Yes, we can have some coffee around the corner. It'd be fun.
Absolutely. And Jessica Beam, I'm gonna turn it over to you, but please, thank you to Greensboro Bound for inviting us all, everyone in downtown Greensboro. This has been great. And every May, you need to look out for this literary festival. And I'm just glad to be a part of it today. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rodney. Great job.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you again for joining us for 21 Conversations. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like and share with your friends and fellow readers. One final reminder that Greensboro Bound is a nonprofit organization committed to bringing together readers and writers throughout the year at zero cost to our community. Please help Greensboro Bound maintain that commitment with a sustaining or one-time gift now. The number to text to give and our website are on your screen. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in person next year.